Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those of you who are out west. Welcome to the second session of the Queen's 2020 International Institute on Social Policy. Thank you all very much for joining us. My name is Margaret Biggs. I'm the Matthews Fellow in Global Public Policy at Queen's University and a member of the steering group for this conference. It is unfortunate that we're not able to meet in person or on campus at Queen's this year. But even though we're not on campus, I would like to acknowledge that Queen's University is situated on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee communities. And we're very grateful to be able to live and learn on these lands. So this is the 25th anniversary of the Queen's Social Policy Conference. And for 25 years, the Queen's Summer Institute has probed the most pressing social policy issues facing Canada and other OECD countries. It's carved out a distinctive niche, bridging research and policy and bringing an international and comparative perspective to bear on Canadian debates. But as I said yesterday, it's fair to say that at no time in the last 2.5 decades has social policy been so front and center and so critical to the future of Canada and other OECD countries. So this week and over the next 3 weeks, in a series of moderated online discussions, we're exploring the major drivers and social impacts of the current pandemic and economic crisis. And we're drilling down into the implications for critical building blocks of our social safety net, income security, social protection and care, labor standards and protection. Yesterday, we had a terrific keynote and kickoff from Professor Darren Acemoglu of MIT on remaking the post-COVID world. Professor Acemoglu dissected the underlying labor market and income dynamics that have been fueling and accelerating many of the social economic dimensions of this crisis. He zeroed in on the institutional policy bias that he argued toward automation that has had a significant impact on labor. And he set out a framework for what he called welfare state 3.0. And if you weren't with us yesterday, I encourage you to listen to his talk. It'll be posted on our conference website later today. Today's session is intended to be a stock taking of what we know to date about the pandemic's impact so far on different OECD economies, sectors, regions, citizens, and generations, and the policy responses of different OECD countries, including Canada. Our moderator today is Catherine Adam, who's the Senior Assistant Deputy Minister for Strategic and Service Policy at Employment and Social Development Canada. Catherine's department and branch are at the center of the Government of Canada's emergency response and recovery efforts, and we're very grateful that she's taken the time to be with us today. Catherine's responsibilities span a wide range of policy issues from early learning and childcare, Canada's poverty reduction plan. She covers intergovernmental affairs. She's held senior roles at the Department of Finance, the Privy Council Office, and Health Canada. So no one is better placed to moderate a discussion of the overall impacts and response to the current crisis than Catherine. Catherine.
Thank you, Margaret. Apologies for the slight delay there, as the technology is certainly going to challenge all of us. Thank you very much. I am so grateful and pleased to be part of the 2020 Queen's International Institute on Social Policy Conference this year and to contribute to this critical issue. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has had a profound impact on the labor market worldwide. We've seen unprecedented increases in unemployment, in layoffs. We have seen it hit marginalized groups and other populations. And all of this coming at us just fast and furious beginning in March and April of this year. The lockdown contributed greatly to this and is something we're still figuring through. And almost half a year later, as we see the restrictions begin to ease across countries, we're seeing important but still unequal employment rebound across countries, sectors of activity, types of job, and gender. Heading into the fall of 2020, the Canadian labor market, the income security system, and the healthcare services are going to continue to face challenges, at least until the end of the pandemic, if not beyond. And it's caused us all to take a look at the systems we have in place and how we can make sure that we're ready both for a safe restart, but ongoing as the pandemic and other challenges roll out across the globe. ESDC, as Margaret suggested, Employment and Social Development Canada, has been at the forefront of the government's response to the crisis. We've been responsible for the development of several relief programs and packages, including the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit, an extension and an increase, a one-time increase to the Canada Child Benefit payments, and supporting Canadians wherever we could in ways that we could find that were flexible to be able to start on a safe rebuild for the next phase of the economic reopening by giving increased access to EI and recovery benefits. This session is going to be a very, very important part of the conference in helping us and in helping all of us think through what we need going forward and to hear different perspectives. We're very fortunate to have two leading experts who are going to start us off by providing their perspective on this important topic. My role here as the moderator is to try to keep things going and to encourage a lively discussion on the important issues. And we've got tight timelines, so I'm also going to play a little bit of a role in trying to make sure we stay on those timelines. Before I, though, turn it over to our expert panelists, I do want to do just a few housekeeping measures for everybody. The first is, after each of the presenters has spoken, I will open the floor to moderated question and answer session. To ask a question, please use the webinar's Q&A function. Identify yourself and type your question in at any time. You'll see the feature at the bottom of your screen. We are asking you to identify yourself, so that just as we would if we were all together at Queen's and you came to the mic. So name, and if you wish, the organization or the institute or that you are representing. Due to time constraints, we might not be able to get to all the questions you have to answer. We're going to be trying to consolidate things behind the scenes, so you may not hear your exact question asked, but you will hear, if it comes in, several people asking the same question. We'll try to consolidate it for the two panelists to be able to get as many questions out on the floor as possible. In terms of the format, so as I said, we'll hear from our presenters. We'll then open it up to Q's and A's, and I'll moderate that session. So with those housekeeping pieces aside, I would like to now introduce our esteemed panelists that are here to speak today on this session. First, we have Stefano Scarpetta, the Director of Employment, Labor and Social Affairs with the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. And we also have Kevin Milligan, Professor of Economics at the Vancouver School of Economics in the University of British Columbia. Stefano Scarpetta is the Director of Employment, Labor and Social Affairs. He joined the OECD in 1991, and he's held several positions of increasing responsibility in that organization. He's led several large-scale research projects, including implementing the OECD job strategy and the sources of economic growth in OECD countries. He also served during the early 2000s as a labor market advisor and lead economist at the World Bank. And in this capacity, he coordinated a bank-wide research program on employment and development and contributed as well extensively to the bank's investment and climate assessments. He's published extensively in academic journals, including the American Economic Review, the Economic Journal, Economic Policy, and the International Journal of Industrial Organization. He holds a PhD in economics from École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, Département et Laboratoire d'Économie Théorique Appliquée in Paris, and is a Master of Science in Economics from the London School of Economics. Kevin Milligan is a professor of economics in the Vancouver School of Economics at the University of British Columbia. He's also affiliated with the C.D. Howe Institute and the National Bureau of Economic Research. And since 2011, he has served as co-editor of the Canadian Tax Journal. He's also recently been appointed to serve as an economic advisor to the clerk of the Privy Council office here in Ottawa. He studied at Queen's University and the University of Toronto, receiving his PhD in 2001. His thesis was awarded the 2002 National Tax Association Dissertation Award, and he is a two-time winner of the esteemed Purvis Prize. His research spans the field of public and labor economics, with a focus on the economics of children and the elderly, as well as other tax and labor market policy topics. So I'd like to welcome to the session first Stefano and then Kevin. So let's start. Stefano, you're first up, and we'll start with your presentation. Thank you very much, everyone. Enjoy.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you, Margaret. It is indeed a great pleasure for me to participate in this webinar as part of the Green Social Policy Conference and to have an opportunity to share with you some of the main highlights of the work we have done at the OECD to assess the impact of the COVID-19 crisis onto our economies and to the labor market. As we all know, more than 200 countries and territories have been affected by the COVID-19, which quickly became the worst health crisis we have seen in a century. The pandemic quickly became a major supply shock because international supply chains were interrupted. Many workers unfortunately got sick, many were quarantined or were in lockdowns, and companies could not operate as previous. The supply shock actually turned also into a major demand shock with a decline of income of households, with the physical distancing. We have seen a significant decline in both consumption and investment. The impact on the labor market, as you said, Catherine, has been indeed massive. In this chart, you have the evolution of the OECD unemployment rate. You can see that in a matter of 3 months until April, all the gains we have obtained in the OECD countries in reducing the unemployment after the global financial crisis were wiped out. In fact, in April, we went back to the level of unemployment we had reached at the peak after the global financial crisis. Of course, as you said, there's been a significant difference across countries in the impact of immediate impact on the labor market of the COVID crisis. In this chart, you have the level of unemployment, the unemployment rate in June of 2020. You can see already large differences. But what I want you to focus on is actually the difference with respect to this little dot, which is the situation back in January of 2020. You can see that in some countries, including indeed Canada, but also the United States, in Colombia and other OECD countries, there's been a very rapid and very significant increase in unemployment. While in a number of other countries, including many of the European countries, the unemployment rate has actually increased only a little. There are a number of reasons for that. First of all, the impact of the COVID has been not happening at the same time in all countries, but also these reflect a significant difference in the policy responses that were introduced by different countries, but also statistical differences because, as you know, in countries like Canada and the United States, those on temporary layoffs are included among the unemployed, while those on a job retention scheme and different forms of short-time working schemes in the other countries were still included among the employed. So very large, very rapid increase, some improvement in the last few months with the reopening of the economy, but this by far has been the worst shock we have seen in terms of the size of the shock, but also the speed at which unemployment has gone up. Before I was mentioning indeed that the massive use of job retention schemes, the numbers you see in this chart is something we have never seen before. It shows you the number of claims as a share of the total workers in different countries, and the numbers are 65% in New Zealand in terms of claims, 55% in France, 45% in Italy, and around 30% in Germany. Now, if I think about what happened after the global financial crisis, which at the time we thought was one of the worst crises we had seen, the numbers were one order of magnitude lower. We talk about 3 to 5% of all workers involved in job retention schemes. What I show you here is actually the approved application, but for some countries, we actually have information about the actual use of the short-time work schemes and the job retention schemes. And you can see that in some countries, the actual use was much lower than the number of approved applications. There are different reasons for that, but some of the most important reasons is that these job retention schemes were made more widespread. All companies and workers could potentially benefit from them. They were made more generous, and also the application were made simpler, yet many of those firms that were not used to be covered by these type of schemes had difficulties in accessing the schemes, in going through all the procedures to actually be able to actually use the support that was provided to try to keep the workers and receive the support. Now, I said that the two margins of adjustment have been on the one end, the decline in employment, so what we call the extensive margin of adjustment onto the labor market, but the other one, especially in many of the European countries, but beyond, has also been a massive reduction in working time. So if we take into account the extensive and the intensive margin of adjustment, and we look at total hours worked for the countries for which we have the information, 11 countries in this chart, you see a massive decline in working time, in total hours worked. We're talking about the equivalent only for the 6 countries for which we have a comparator with the financial crisis of 50 million equivalent full-time jobs. What this chart also shows you is something which in my view is important, is the difference between what happened this time with the COVID crisis compared to what happened after the global financial crisis. Again, we are talking about an impact which is 1 order of magnitude bigger. We're talking about 12% reduction in total hours worked this time around. It was 1.2% on average in these countries after the global financial crisis. In Canada, we are talking about 20%, more than 20% drop in total hours worked, compared to a 2% that happened after the global financial crisis. So massive immediate reaction onto the labor market. But as you said, Catherine, of course, we are still in the midst of the crisis, at least in terms of the economic impact, and therefore we could well expect the impact to continue going forward. If we take into account the two dimensions, we decompose them, we can see a chart that shows you really differences in the way in which this crisis, the impact on the labor market has been managed. In some countries, including Canada, US, but also Mexico, there has been a significant reduction in the short term, at least in employment, and also a significant reduction in working time. You can see that in a number of other countries, much of the adjustment has been on working hours. So the impact, at least in the short term, on the extensive margin, in the intensive margin has been lower. But the impact has been large in many of the countries, ranging in between 15 to 20%, in some cases actually reaching out 30% in total hours worked. Now, I think Catherine mentioned that, which is a very important point. I think COVID-19 respects no border. In theory, anyone can be affected, can contract the virus, but the economic and social impact of the COVID-19 crisis has been hugely differentiated across groups. And unfortunately, some of the most vulnerable groups have been the ones most affected by the immediate impact of the crisis on the economy and onto the labor market. Existing vulnerability indeed have been exposed, and inequalities have become more entrenched. Those on precarious contract found themselves without a safety net, either because they were not receiving, they were not part of the job retention schemes, or did not have enough contribution to receive unemployment insurance. In particular, some groups, the self-employed, those on temporary or part-time workers, have been significantly affected. In Canada, for example, in between February and April, employment among temporary workers declined by about 30%. Low-paid workers have also been deeply affected for a number of reasons, because they are in jobs that are on the front line, so they could not stop working, so they took risk of actually get the infection themselves, but also because they were less able to work from home. So in Canada, those at the lowest end of the quartile, the first quartile, only 50% of them can work from home, while actually these represent 50% of those at the top quartile. And 47% of those of the bottom quartile stopped working altogether, compared to only 14% among those in the top quartile. Unfortunately, yet again, young people have been very disproportionately affected. You see here the significant increase in the youth unemployment rate across OECD countries. Many of the temporary jobs were not renewed. Entry jobs were no longer available, were frozen, and therefore young people have already suffered significant disproportionate effect. And last but certainly not least, this time around, women have been disproportionate effect. They represent a very high proportion of those in the health workforce, those who were actually at the work, but also because they are in sectors which are more affected by the lockdown, by the confinement measure, and also because many of them are in more precarious type of employment, who had to reconcile family responsibility with the school being closed together with actually work responsibilities. Now, I think one of the themes of this conference is how not only to rebuild, but to build a better labor market. I think one of the key pillars of this reflection should indeed be as to whether our social protection system provide adequate cover to everyone. Just to single out one possible dimension is the coverage among the self-employed for two key social protection items. One is the unemployment benefit, the other one is the sickness, invalidity, and work injury benefits. You can see on the vertical axis, the incidence across countries, but also you see that in a number of countries, the self-employed do not have access to unemployment benefit, and may have a weaker access even to sickness, invalidity, and work injury benefits. Now, a number of countries, including Canada, have introduced measures to actually widen the coverage of some of the key social protection programs, also to the self-employed, also to those in a non-standard form of employment. The key question that I think we still have to discuss is whether this measure was successful to reach out all of those who were not covered by these programs in normal times, and actually to learn the lesson as to whether some of these extension of these programs should be kept also in the recovery phase. Now, I was saying that this has been an unprecedented crisis, but so was the policy response. You know that in G20 countries, we are talking about 10 trillion that were put into, to some extent, redressing the economy, helping individual households and companies facing the major shock that the COVID-19 brought about. And here in this chart, using our policy tracker, I just indicate the percentage of the total OECD countries that have introduced a number of key measures. Financial support for firms, 100% of the OECD countries. Income support to people losing job incomes, again, a very large proportion of the OECD countries. The income support for those quarantine workers, helping households and parents with unforeseen care needs. The job retention scheme that I was mentioning before. Actually, health and safety to reduce the worker exposure to the COVID-19, the extension of paid leave, helping workers staying at home, and to some extent in some countries even changing temporarily dismissal regulation. Canada has been actually championing many of these measures across a wide range of the policy intervention that I'm just listing. And indeed now the big question is how do we adapt these policy packages to the new circumstance in which Canada and many other OECD countries are facing, which is the one in which the economy is reopening. Some sectors are managing to go back into even full activities, while other sectors are still severely constrained, and therefore they need continued support to avoid massive layoffs and major problems for all the workers involved in these sectors. That's very difficult because one thing was to introduce and to put a lot of money into the economy, but to everyone. Another thing is, of course, to start targeting and differentiating support depending on the situation in which individual workers, companies, and food sector are actually under. So here we list a set of issues that, of course, have to be looked at the country level because they are very different across the board. Staying safe, of course, is very important. We are still living with the virus. We don't have a vaccine, we don't have effective treatment. So provide health and safety for the workforce is essentially for all of those who are coming back to work, those in the essential services, but also those in the other activities which are reopening. This in particular, in my view, require significant support to the small and medium-sized enterprises. Those enterprises might find it particularly difficult to adapt the work practices and to ensure the health and safety. I think there is a need to extend sick leave entitlement on a permanent basis to all of those who were not entitled before the crisis, but also there is the need to enhance the rehabilitation support to prevent moves into long-term unemployment. So I think, again, the point here, a number of people have lost their job, is to provide adequate support in terms of job search and also investment in skill and retraining so that they can be back into jobs, even if these are different jobs than the one they held before. I think there is a persistent need to provide income support, although, again, differentiate depending on the conditions. Those who have lost a job, of course, but also there is a need to target other basic income support schemes, again, for those who are more at risk of actually seeing significant drop in their income and possibly at risk of moving to poverty. But I think it's very important to reintroduce, both when we look at the income support, some job search requirement. The economy is restarting. Some jobs have been created, and it's very important to mobilize those who have lost a job back into employment. The big challenge for those countries who have used massively also job retention schemes is how to adapt these schemes going forward. Again, it is very important to keep the support to those sectors which are still deeply affected by the crisis, but at the same time to reintroduce some conditionalities for companies in those sectors where actually economic activity has restarted. So target jobs which are viable in the long term, but also encourage those in short-time work schemes to regain, to some extent, to increase the working hours if that's possible, or to be in connection with the public employment service in case some of their job might not be viable in the medium to longer term, and they might have to find new job opportunities. I think the main theme of this conference is also how to build better, back better. And I think here I just want to conclude with 4 main areas in which I think a reflection should take place at the national level, but I think also at the international level. I think this crisis has laid bare very clearly the gaps that do exist in our social protection labor market systems, even in the most advanced OECD countries. So I think we have to learn the lessons of how some of these programs have been extended to cover those who are not generally covered by these programs, and maybe maintain or to some extent adapt these schemes to provide a minimum support to everyone. I think we have to see how to increase the responsiveness of minimum income support benefits. I think we really have to focus specifically on the young people. We know that intervention to support young people after the global financial crisis in many countries came on board too late, when many of the problems of scars, if you like, long-term effect on youth were actually there already. We need to do better this time with a comprehensive set of policies that could help young people, either those still in education or those who are about to transit into the labor market, or those who have just entered the labor market, lost their job and find it very difficult to find a new one. The young people, goes without saying, are the future, and I think we should really avoid sort of permanent scars on that generation. Of course, we have to work on women because they've been on the front line, as I said before. We have to look at how to tackle the unequal care burden on women, strengthen the family-friendly working time arrangement, promote women in managerial leadership positions. These are the issues that in Canada and many G20 countries have been on the agenda for a long time. I think, again, that the significant disproportionate effect on women should let us reflect on how we can make significant progress in this area. Last but not least, foster low pay and displaced workers. We need to help them to boost job creation through a number of measures that exist in different countries: target tax cut, subsidies, and investment. Establish a system of deliver timely and flexible employment support using better, to some extent, the digital technology. We have been using massively telework. I think public employment services have used more aggressively also digital tools. I think there is a lot we can learn from this early effort in order to make the public employment service more effective, to be able to respond to what are going to be major challenges also that will characterize our labor market in the short and into the medium term. I see that Catherine has popped up, which means that my time is over. I would like to thank you for your attention, and I very much look forward for our discussion today. Thank you.
Dr. Scarpetta, thank you. That was absolutely fascinating, and being able to see the global comparisons among so many OECD countries on some of the major trends, and it's really quite revealing. I'd like to turn it over now to Dr. Milligan. Kevin, it's your turn, and you have the floor.
Okay, thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me here. So I'm Kevin, I'm from UBC. I'm going to talk about 2 things. One is what's gone on in the Canadian labor market over the past, what are we on now, 5 months or so. And then talk about some lessons for policy that come out of that. So first, let's just take a look at what a regular recession looks like. Let's remind ourselves what a regular recession looks like. This is looking at the change from the date of the onset of a recession in the number of people who are employed and at work. And what we have here is the 1981 recession, and you can see that from the start of the recession, it took about 20 months to get to the bottom part, where we had a drop of about 6% in the proportion of people who were employed at work. And then it fully recovered somewhere around month 43. So that's like 3.5 years later. So that's 1981. We can add to that a couple of other recessions, the 1990 recession and the 2008 recession. You'll see they had kind of different shapes in certain ways. All of them led to a drop of 3, 4, 5% in the proportion of people who are employed and at work, and took some months to get to the bottom and some months again to get to the top. All right, just for the context of what we're going through now, let's take a look and try to graph it on the same graph. First of all, we have to shift the axis. So we're going to shove all that up, and then we're going to graph what happened now. And that's in purple. And we can see that this is from the date of onset. So for the purple line, for the current thing, this is looking at, I'm not sure if at February or March is the first. I guess February would be the 0 date, the top. February 2020 there. Took a couple months to get to the bottom. And then since then, since April, we have bounced back quite a bit. When we use the measure of the proportion of the change in employed at work. So while we were down almost 30% back in April, we're now down only about 8% from the bottom. Who was affected by this? I'm not going to go into great detail here, but I can refer you to a recent paper that just came out in Canadian Public Policy by me, Tamara Lemieux, Tammy Sherrill, and Michael Scooterud, that looks in depth at what happened and who was hit most by this. Answer that is not going to surprise many people is hit low-wage workers in public-facing industries and occupations, women a bit more than men, and young workers more than old workers. The most stark comparison that I've seen looks at just people who are paid hourly versus people who are salaried, especially if you look at recovery over this summer. Salaried workers have almost completely recovered. Hourly workers have not. So that's who was affected. What I'm going to look at in the next few slides is a bit more what the shape of the recovery so far has looked like. And what's really important there is to look at how non-workers get classified. And this is something that's important, especially when you look at the kind of international comparisons that Stefano was showing us before. And in particular, what I would argue is the weakness of unemployment rates as a measure of that. If someone is not working, there are many ways that they can be classified in our labor force survey or in equivalent surveys in other countries. If you are laid off, whether that's a short run layoff or a long run layoff, you could be classified as unemployed if you're searching for work. What we saw in the first few months of the crisis was that some people just didn't search because what the hell is the point of searching in the middle of a pandemic, especially if you're just on some kind of temporary layoff and you fully expect to come back. But if you do report search, you get classified as unemployed. If you do not search, you can be classified as being read out of the labor force. And again, this distinction between search and not search is something that varies across country. And folks at places like the OECD work hard in trying to make these measures internationally comparable. But just to point out that distinction between unemployed and not in the labor force is a very difficult one in the space of this unprecedented episode. Finally, you can imagine people who kept their job but just aren't getting any shifts. If you're an hourly worker or you're on furlough and expect to be called back, you can be classified as employed but absent from work. So when you think about these, this is what things look like when we compare February as kind of the pre-crisis position to what we saw in April, which was close to the bottom of what happened in the labor market. What you can see is that Canada, in terms of people who were employed and at work, lost about 5.4 million workers. But these are split across a number of categories. One is people not in the labor force, that was about 1.7 million. People who were newly classified as unemployed, we were up about 1.3 million of those. And employed but absent from work, that was about 2.4 million. These are classifications from the labor force survey. So again, when someone who's in the labor force survey gets asked to say whether they're searching for work or not, whether they expect to go back to work, whether they kept their job, it's not obvious to me that everyone exactly nailed it in the same way that maybe a labor economist would have nailed it in terms of classifying where they were. So these classifications might be a bit weak, but here's what we had from the labor force survey. We were down in something that is clear, I think, is are you actually employed and are you actually working? We knew we dropped 5.4 million of those. That's pretty clear to me. How we classify these across categories is a bit less clear, but let's take a bit deeper on that. Let's look at where we are now as of July, which is the most recent numbers we got. We got these in early August. We'll get the August numbers in early September in a few weeks. you can see that we made pretty substantial progress in a lot of these categories. So as an example, look at the brownish tan bar here. For people who were employed but absent from work in April, there were 2.4 million of those. By the time we hit July, that had dwindled to only 266,000. I expect to see that go down a bit more as we hit August and September. So that was a lot of people got called back to work. In the not in labor force category, again, in April, there was a huge jump in people not in the labor force, and that's now dwindled from 1.76 million down to 456,000. And then for unemployment, it's shifted around, and we'll see in the next slide how the composition of that has changed. We'll see shortly how that has changed. In looking across these LFS categories from the labor force survey, I found 3 categories that I thought showed people who were a good likelihood of a ready rematch, that there was a pretty clear link back to their previous job. And again, thinking back to the schemes that we saw in Europe where, you know, they were explicitly on furlough and didn't pass through unemployment. And this has been a topic of some concern in Canada, especially when we see those international comparisons from the spring where the Canadian unemployment rate was so much higher than European countries. That doesn't concern me as much as some other people, because a lot of that, to my mind, is just how we classified people in our labor force survey. There were people sitting at home who had a good connection back to their job. In European countries, they're still classified as employed. In Canada, we classify them as unemployed or not in the labor force, but it wasn't clear to me that there was actually a lot of functional difference between those. So these 3 categories, people who are employed and absent, they're going to get called back from furlough. People who were unemployed, we saw a huge surge in people classified as a temporary layoff. And people not in the labor force, again, there was a big surge in people who were classified as not in the labor force, but awaiting recall. So those were the categories in the labor force survey that I classified as kind of ready rematches. And here's what we saw. To understand this graph, look first at the blue line. The blue line shows what happened between February and April. So we saw an increase of about 3.9 million in these categories of ready rematches, and we've gained back 82% of those. Where have they come from? So the purple line is July. So this was as of April. Green is as of May. Orange triangle is June, and purple diamond as of July. So as we saw with the employed absent, got back almost all of them now. In terms of the temporary layoff, we've seen that decline an awful lot as well. So again, that concern of that heightened unemployment rate that we saw relative to Europe, a lot of those on temporary layoff have been called back to work, which is great. And again, in the not in the labor force category, we've seen that shrink by a substantial amount as well, as people have been called back to work. Now, some of those folks in all of these categories, not all of them, not 100% of them, were transformed from, you know, being on furlough back to the job, or temporary layoff back to their job. Some of them, they thought they were on a temporary layoff and it turned into a permanent layoff. And that's, of course, a policy concern. But an important point here is that a lot of people did get called back to work. So specifically, let's look at that increase in unemployment. And so the first part here is, again, what we saw between February and April. And we saw that the vast majority of these, like 1.2 million out of the, 1.2 million, I can't read that, out of the, 1.238 million out of the 1.285 million total increase in unemployment, was in temporary layoffs. So it was almost all temporary layoffs initially. Now, as we have gone forward to July, what we see is some of those folks who were not in the labor force have now rejoined, and we see that the category of unemployment, an awful lot is new and re-entrants to the labor market. We see that there's still some on temporary layoff, but that is really getting smaller through time. And we see an increasing amount that are on either permanent layoff or they've left their job. Setting aside these 304,000 that are on temporary layoff, we add up the other 2 categories here of permanent layoff and new entrants. These are folks who are seeking new jobs. So what we saw in April was a very different thing than what we're seeing in July. And what I expect to see when we get the August numbers into the fall is that the proportion of people in unemployment who are kind of in this temporary category is going to shrink. And what we're going to see is the unemployment is going to get us back to more of a normal labor market, where people who are in unemployment are those who are looking for a job and aren't just waiting around to get hired back at their old firm. And that's important for thinking about what policy might want to look like going forward. So to summarize this so far, the impact of the initial crisis was on women, on low-wage workers, hourly paid workers, young workers, and all of those mostly in public-facing industries. It was mostly initially temporary, mostly in these ready rematch categories. We have regained, out of the 3.9 million that were initially in those ready rematch categories, we've gained back 3.2 million of those. So that's 82% of those ready rematches have been made. Some were initially in the longer term categories, but that has grown through time as some of those ready rematches were not converted back to matches. And we see new entrants and re-entrants into the labor market, which means people are looking for jobs, that not going back to their old workplace, but looking for something new. And so that's kind of where we are as we hit the fall of 2020. So thinking about lessons for policy, this is very much aligned with what Stefano was mentioning across the OECD. One thing is the non-standard work, thinking of ways to cover the uncovered, whether that be self-employed workers, whether that be part-time workers, who are not covered well now. Some interesting questions. I read a really excellent OECD report came out I think in 2018, that surveyed OECD countries and how they cover these kinds of workers. And what was really interesting is that it's not obvious that a lot of these workers, at least pre-COVID, actually wanted coverage. When workers were offered kind of actuarially fair coverage, where they kind of paid in on average what they were getting back in benefits in a voluntary basis, it was very rare that workers actually took that up on a voluntary basis. Where you did see take up is in countries where, the benefits were many multiples of what that sector paid in to the coverage. So as an example, there's a special program, and I'm not making this up, in France for theater workers. And they got paid on average something like 4 or 5 times what on average they were paying into the program. And this program ended up being pretty popular with the theater workers in France. In contrast, when they were offered something in other countries that was more actuarially fair, take up tended to be pretty small. So a very good question is this different this time? Is there now an awareness that there are risks that maybe we want to have covered, and self-employed workers may have a different attitude going forward, and society may have a different attitude about whether we want to force self-employed workers into a mandatory scheme, because maybe the attitude is, look, we're going to have to cover you in extreme shocks anyway, so you should be paying into it to start with. Those are questions that we will be addressing as we think about covering the unemployed. So I don't know the answer of whether it's changed attitudes and changed opinions. What it clearly showed is that our existing programs did not cover these folks for this kind of extreme shock. Second thing that I think we learned was the timeliness and ease of access to policy. If you remember policy debates back in March, and back in March specifically, there was a lot of doubt about whether the government of Canada was going to be able to deliver something like CERB. There was, whether it was in social media or in more traditional op-ed kind of reactions, there was a heap of doubt thrown at the government about whether they were going to be able to do this. As it turns out, they were. And CERB went through fairly smoothly. Of course, there were some people along the edges of eligibility where it was not so smooth, but for the vast majority of people, the access was smooth, got their payment within a few days of applying. And I think what Canadians learned and what people in the government learned is that accessing benefits can actually be a lot easier than we have made it. And that there may be some desire, both from Canadians and from their governments, that we try to apply that lesson going forward. Can we do that to EI? Can we do that at the provincial level, the social assistance programs, where instead of making these things full of barriers to access, can we think about what we learned from CERB and kind of flip that around from a verify then pay model to what Jennifer Robson has called the trust but verify model that we've used with CERB, where we trust you up front, start paying the money, and then we start the verification checks and make adjustments as we go along. Now, that's what we did with CERB. The questions that arise is about integrity measures, enforcement, and public reaction to mistakes. What happens, and we all know, people who have watched these cycles of programs before, that when a new program is introduced, all it takes is one mistake where someone was paid a benefit that they weren't owed, one check to a dead person, one check to someone who wasn't eligible, and that blows up as a political firestorm. Now, I'm not going to blame that on the media. I'm not going to blame that on our opposition politicians. I'm going to say that we all bear responsibility for that, in that it's the public reaction that drives that. Why does the media cover it? It's because it's clickbait. People love to read the story of someone who got something they didn't deserve. And then when the media covers it, the opposition covers it, it gets into these firestorms. If we're going to move to a permanent, take a lesson from CERB and do some kind of trust but verify model more broadly, we have to understand that there are going to be some people who get benefits that those benefits are going to end up, when we get to the verify part of trust but verify, that those benefits are going to be taken away. And whether that's public reaction to taking benefits away from someone who previously got it, whether they deserve those benefits or not, that whole set of issues has not gone away. I think we have learned some lessons that we ought to try to apply, but I'm just suggesting it's not as easy as perhaps some people think to impose a trust but verify model on our broader social safety net system, because a lot of those constraints on people, on voters, on citizens' concerns about people getting benefits that they may not, quote unquote, be eligible for, are not going to be going away. The final thing as a lesson for policy is thinking about benefit adequacy and timing, and this is my last point. Normally there's a trade-off that we think about, at least as economists, between generosity and work effort or search effort. I think that what we've seen over the summer was there was a different trade-off during COVID. In fact, perhaps we wanted people not to work, and so making that benefit more generous was a good thing in terms of the spreading a virus. That's a different policy trade-off. But also what we've seen, the evidence I've seen in Canada and the US suggests that lots of people are taking jobs that are low wage and part-time still, even in this period where people had access to CERB. So it's not clear that work effort was actually pared back in the summer. We will see going forward that perhaps we get back to a world where we are put more weight on those work incentives and search efforts and how that looks at things. The other note I would take from this about benefit adequacy and timing is that both in Canada and the US, to a very remarkable amount, overall consumer expenditure has rebounded really quickly. And my conjecture is that would not have happened without the widespread income support that happened to families. That if we did not have CERB, if the US did not have their $600 UI checks, that we would not have seen household expenditure maintained in the same way. And so working into our analysis, what happens, the macro impact is, I think, an important thing going forward and thinking about benefit adequacy, especially in time of deep recession. So I'll stop there and turn it back over to Catherine as the chair, and I look forward to taking some questions. Thanks very much. Great.
Dr. Milligan, thank you very, very much for that presentation and the insights of looking at labor force survey data to really get a good sense of really underneath it all what might be happening in the Canadian context. There's a number of questions that have come in from the floor, but I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask the first question myself, and it is to both of you. It's clear from the evidence that you've both presented here that some segments of the labor market are recovering better and more quickly as economies are ramping up. But you've equally both touched on how there are some segments of society that are having different experiences, both at the start of the pandemic and even now, and may face a more challenging path to recovery. One of the pieces that we're really fascinated with and exploring, trying to get a good grip on here at ESDC is how a return to labor market for lone women with children is going to be, how that's going to look, and whether or not we've really got a serious issue there that we need to take a look at policy responses. So to start the discussion, I wonder if you both could reflect on what the labor market evidence is showing you for these more vulnerable members of society, including people in caring responsibilities, racialized groups. Do we have enough data about racialized groups, whether it's in Canada or internationally, to kind of get a sense of what might be going on? Also young people, persons with disabilities, and what are the implications for recovery, both in the short and longer term? And can we, for instance, expect permanent structural changes in the labor market because of these vulnerable groups and the challenges they may have ahead?
Go ahead, Stefano, if you'd like.
Thank you, Catherine, for these questions. I think it's good to sort of distinguish the answer in two parts. First of all, I think both Kevin and I have shown clearly evidence about the fact that there was a disproportionate effect of the immediate impact of the COVID crisis on different groups. I think the list is very similar across a wide range of the OECD countries. Those who were already vulnerable before the crisis were disproportionately affected by the crisis itself in terms of losing their job, a significant loss of income, for a number of reasons, either because their job was more precarious or because they were in sectors which have been more deeply affected by the confinement measures, also because they did not have access to the same kind of social protection system that other workers in more standard forms of employment had. So I think the immediate response, despite the significant pickup in employment that Kevin was documenting from Canada, that actually we also see a number of other OECD countries, is actually to focus on these groups that have already been deeply affected by the first impact of the crisis. The second, I think, is also going forward, because I think Kevin and I would agree that we are not out of the woods, in the sense that we have seen the first impact of the COVID-19 crisis, which was basically policy induced to a large extent through very severe confinement measure, if not full lockdown. I think the next few months will be crucial, first of all, in terms of whether or not countries will manage to avoid a second wave of rapid spread of the infection of the COVID-19, but also because I think a number of small and medium-sized enterprises might really have to figure out whether or not they are still viable in a context, in an economy which is still deeply affected by the COVID crisis. So my sense, without sounding too pessimistic, that we might actually see a second wave of unemployment, not sort of the type of unemployment that Kevin was describing, that can actually be people basically on temporary off, waiting to come back to be rematched, but actually normal unemployed, people who really have lost a job and for whom support is needed in terms of to moving back into employment. My sense is that the same group that was affected in the first instance, so in the first impact of the COVID-19 crisis onto the labor market, are likely to be those who are going to be impacted also in the medium term, so in the next year or so. Of course, some workers in some sector are regaining activity because this sector are reopening. Hopefully, they will continue to stay open. Other workers in other sectors are still deeply affected. So I think it's not only by group, but also by work in different sectors, the support is needed. So that would be my answer. So we have to look at those already affected because they need support. Going forward, we know which sector are reopening, which sector we find it very difficult to reopen to a large scale, and therefore we have to focus on those workers. Politically, this is perhaps even more difficult than basically providing support to everyone. As soon as you start targeting, as soon as you start differentiating the same program, some sectors, some companies get it, others don't get it, or they get it only if they actually co-pay. I think politically it's very difficult to put in place, but this is absolutely essential. Otherwise, the risk is that, as Kevin was saying, Europe, many workers will not go back to work or will stay in this job retention scheme, even if the sector is actually reopened. So reintroducing conditionality, promoting return to work, so to some extent, asking those who are unemployed to search for job is, in my view, very important. But the targeting, in my view, is really essential. And I think, again, we all agree, I think, on the need to be careful about how to permanently extend some of the benefits that were done during the first phase of the crisis. We have got to be very careful about that. But on the other hand, we really have to reflect as to whether some of the, at least basic support should not be extended to many workers. We can go in more details about the self-employed because I definitely tend to agree with Kevin, but I think there is a need now to start thinking about how to build a better social protection system, learning also the lesson from this crisis.
Thanks. I'll just add a couple of comments. So in terms of the long run effect, you know, one piece of evidence that I draw on is work that looks at what happens to post-secondary graduates when they come out in the middle of a recession. There's been work in Canada by Andrew Heiss and Phil Oriopoulos on that, and there's been other international work that suggests that graduating in the middle of a recession takes 10, 15 years to recover from relative to people who happen to graduate in a better labor market. So, you know, folks who are graduating this year, boy, they certainly graduated in a recession in a job market that didn't have a lot of labor demand. And so there is a sense that it takes some time to recover from that. And it can be a fairly long run recovery. That's point one. Point two is thinking about how we structure our programs and our thinking about some of the things Stefano just mentioned of enterprises and firms that are not going to survive, and by some economic sense, maybe shouldn't survive. Thinking of the tourism sector as a clear example, you know, we're not going to be having cruise ships in Vancouver for a while. I don't know when. I'm not going to predict when. I'll just say a while. So if I owned a small business that was selling stuff to cruise ship passengers, I would, you know, I'm not sure this is a business we want to keep going for a couple of years or something. And so we have to think about making sure that labor from those sectors that are not going to be viable for a while can find productive use in other sectors, and that we make sure there's labor demand in other sectors. And so this is part of a more macroeconomic response that can be helpful, that there's going to be large shifts across sectors, at least in the medium run. I don't know as much about the long run, but in the medium run, there's certainly going to be shifts across sectors. And we want to make sure that policy supports that shift and does not inhibit it. Final point about particular groups, as we've seen in the work that I cited and that Stefano has mentioned as well, definitely impact on different groups that we have seen. Do we have enough data? We have some. StatsCan has improved over the course of the past few months, data specifically on employment status by race in the LFS. That was an innovation that they did in the middle of the crisis, which was really impressive. They were able to get that done. This is something we have to monitor going forward because there are big differences across groups, and that helps to guide the policy response to make sure that we are attentive to those differences and can design policy that's appropriate to it.
Thank you both very much. I have a question from the floor, and it is addressed to you both. The question is, if either of you has a view on why the Canadian Job Retention Program, the wage subsidy program, was so underutilized by business.
I'll jump into that since it's Canadian specific. Then maybe Stefano can pick up on more the international dimension of these programs. I think it's clearly just a question of timing. Having watched what happened in the pandemic and talking to some business people and others, you know, as it turned out, it took longer to get the wage subsidy up and going than it did the CERB. And so many businesses making their decision, okay, we have no revenue right now. I'm a restaurant. Am I going to put my workers on the wage subsidy or the CERB? Well, in early April, there was only one answer, which is the CERB. That's all there was. The wage subsidy was not available at that point. So that's what they did. And by the time the wage subsidy came along, decisions were already made. Boats had already sailed. That said, people have underestimated how much the wage subsidy has actually been used, because you can apply for it ex post. You can still apply for the March wage subsidy. And when you look back to the first period of the wage subsidy now, we're well over 2 million Canadians were supported by it. And so with the initial wave of how many were supported by it in March, that number has changed dramatically as we've gone forward because firms have gone back and reapplied for it later on. And so, you know, it wasn't as underutilized as it initially appeared. Why did this happen? This happened, I think, just because of the way programs rolled out, and we can have maybe we should have a report at some future date about why that happened and all those Zoom calls that led to programs being able to be rolled out as they were in the middle of a pandemic. That's just the timing of how things ended up working out. I'll stop there and pass over to Stefano, maybe talk about the international experience with these programs.
Thank you, Kevin. I think you said it all. The point I want to make here is this was a very unusual sort of type of shock. It was a supply shock which was largely policy induced. So we asked workers and companies to start operating to a large extent in those non-vital sectors. So I would argue that a job retention scheme, whether wage subsidy or a short-time work schemes, make really perfect sense from an economic point of view. So to some extent, the deadweight costs, which always characterize these schemes, are consideration which play a lower type of role in this specific case, so during the lockdown, during the confinement period. But I think what we have learned from the experience of a wide range of countries is that if you are late in putting in place the scheme, or if the scheme is not well known, I think companies might not actually not use it, especially if they have an alternative way to adjust. I think in Canada, like the US, the furlough or the temporary off is something which workers and companies are used to use, which is much more so than what we have found, for example, in Europe. If you lose your job in Europe, whatever sort of a guarantee of commitment that your employer made to you, the chances that actually the employer will take you back are actually pretty low. The important point is that many countries, not only European countries, have extended dramatically the coverage of the job retention schemes, covering basically all sectors, all firms. And I think the chart I show you between the claims and the actual use, the gap between these two is because many, in particular small and medium-sized enterprises, did not manage to get the benefits, even though they apply for it, for them. Because I mean, there are procedures, so there is administrative procedure you have to go through. During a lockdown, it's very difficult even to send an application to get the response and so on and so forth. So the lesson I would draw is that this kind of scheme in certain specific circumstances can be particularly useful. They have to be in place already before the crisis. They have to be well known, and they have to be as simple as possible so that not only large companies, but also small and medium-sized enterprise can use them effectively as a way to reduce what is sort of unnecessary unemployment, at least in the short term.
Yeah, just to jump in on that, I mean, for several European countries, they already had these kind of schemes, small scale, but they had an administrative infrastructure already there. So Germany had the Kurzarbeit program, and other countries had similar things. That was a base they were able to use to build out their administration. In Canada, we were starting totally from scratch, and we were able to get something up and going in like a month, which in bureaucratic terms is really fast, but in pandemic terms was too slow.
If I can just add the final point, the numbers are just something we have never seen. Again, I showed you before. We are talking about 55% of private sector employees in France being covered by the chômage partiel. We're talking about 45% of Italian employees being covered by that. So these numbers are something we have never seen before. So I think there would be a lot of research work to be done after this COVID crisis to actually assess how these schemes were used, and whether or not they were used also for companies that even in the early phases of the COVID crisis were no longer viable. But I think in terms of, given the nature of this shock, was important to provide, at least to scale up these schemes in those countries where the schemes were known and therefore could be used earlier on by employers.
Thank you both very much. I have a question also, again, from the floor. It was addressed to you, Dr. Scarpetta, but I think Dr. Milligan, you may also have views on this one, and it is whether or not you have some comments or observations about what you've seen internationally about policies that work. And the example given here was New Zealand and Australia, who have a form of a job seeker's benefit as a bridge between social assistance and employment insurance. And the question is it a good mechanism to capture those who fall through the social safety net gap, as well as the sort of the non-standard, the self-employed, et cetera? And could it be effective in the Canadian context?
I think it's something we should definitely reflect upon, this experience of the two countries, Australia and New Zealand, indeed. I think this actually brings me back to a general point I want to make from Kevin's presentation, because I think what we have seen this time around to a massive scale, it was already there, very clear even before, is the fact that a number of employees in non-standard form of employment did not have enough contribution to receive the kind of insurance benefit that they were potentially entitled to. we actually experience, we've been discussing that extensively, the fact that there are new forms of employment, those in between and being a self-employed and a dependent employed person, and so on and so forth. So our labor market is becoming much more heterogeneous, and I think we have to reflect properly about how to adapt the social protection systems, including the schemes that you were referring to, as a bridge in between the insurance and the assistance. I think the important point is that it's not just as easy as providing benefit to everyone. There are very good reasons why a number of self-employed do not want to pay contribution and prefer to insure themselves. The problem is that we are seeing a significant increase in these relatively low income, unstable type of activities, self-employed, related to the platform economy, but going beyond that. And I think thinking about how a minimum form of protection can be provided to that, even if this is through general taxation, I think is an important point. I think the potential economic and social impact of having too many people fall into the cracks of social protection are something that we should try to avoid going forward. Again, I've been participating for more than 10 years in the reflection at the G20 level. The idea of a social protection floor has always been there for a number of years. I think we should now start thinking seriously at the country level, of course, about how to try to make progress. Of course, taking into account incentive on the one hand, but also, and possible disincentive effect, but on the other hand, the need to provide a minimum protection. I think, again, the point that Kevin is absolutely right. In countries like the UK or the Netherlands, there is such a difference in terms of income taxes between an employee and a self-employed that many people prefer to be self-employed, even if they're actually false self-employed. They only work for one provider, for one company. So we have to deal with that not only through social protection policy, but through a wide range of policy, may altogether, to some extent, set the incentive in a particular direction or another direction.
Yeah, I would just add that, so thanks for the examples of New Zealand and Australia. There are a lot of examples across OECD countries of how they've dealt with these challenges. And I think as Canada goes forward to consider what we might do to improve the coverage of the uncovered, we really have to make use of those international examples in trying to forge something that works for Canada and works for the kind of labor market that we have in North America that is quite different than the European one, but allows us to borrow what works and set aside what doesn't. Because I think there is going to be a lot of desire to look again at covering these folks, and there's a lot of evidence internationally on how to do it and how not to do it, so we should draw from that.
Thank you both. There's another question from the floor, and I feel we're perhaps dancing around it a little bit as well in some of the comments. It ties into the comments both of you have made about the importance of considering disincentives to work, the gap in the existing safety net here in Canada, about different ways countries have approached it. And the question actually is not only deeply related to the topic that we're discussing here, but with Germany's announcement, I think it was this week, of a very small pilot. The question is there a role for a guaranteed basic income program to complement or replace certain benefits? And could it be used for certain key populations? And I guess it's both in an international context, given there really hasn't been a long-standing successful study done around a guaranteed basic income. Germany's a new announcement this week, but also in the Canadian context, Kevin.
Yes, indeed, this has been a topic which has been discussed extensively in many countries and actually internationally. I think it depends to some extent on what are we talking about. So a minimum guaranteed income, which is well targeted on some groups who are not already potentially eligible for other form of income support, I think is something has to be discussed in each individual country. I think another thing would be a universal basic income, something that actually potentially goes to everyone. At OECD, we have done some very simple calculation using our tax benefit model. Anything that looks like a universal basic income, even if you eliminate all the other transfers, just keep the pensions and disability benefit, would actually imply a significant increase in taxes and actually have very negative impact on some of those who today receive very well targeted form of income support. I think a targeted form of basic income is something we should definitely consider, precisely for the discussion we had before, in the sense that there are new forms of work that even in a country which is more based on insurance-based social protection systems are either not eligible because they don't have enough contribution, or are not paying contribution at all, and therefore they're not covered. So I think the The notion is something which we should reflect at the country level. The way in which this could be implemented depends on the different countries, but I think the concept is something, if we move away from the notion of a universal basic income, for which of course is not feasible.
Yeah, thanks. A couple of points here. So first, there is a very, very big, comprehensive and deep study of basic income that was commissioned by the BC government, the British Columbia government, that should be coming out this fall. I encourage everyone who's interested in this topic to look at it. It will be the definitive study of this in Canada. It's not just an op-ed. It's not a promise of a pilot of 100 people like this Germany thing that got all the headlines. It's an actual, real, deep study. And I think we should all look forward to reading that when it comes out. A couple of points to pick up what Stefano said. I find this discussion always so confusing because there's so many huge differences between programs that people mean when they say this. On one end, you have the universal program where you get rid of all of the issues of defining household and defining income and means testing and all of that stuff. And that sounds great, except for a universal model, as Stefano said, would cost us hundreds of billions of dollars and is really a non-starter from that point of view. So then you get into questions of targeting, of means testing, of delivery. Then we're back into the world where essentially we are now. We're dealing with how do we target, how do we deliver these programs, and I'm not sure there's much difference between that discussion and the regular discussion we're having. Final point about this, when you're talking a universal model or a more limited model, often these are sold as we are going to replace a whole bundle of programs with a flat universal or flat benefit of some kind, universal or not. I think it's not just a question of affordability. This is a question of what is good policy. And when you replace needs-based funding with flat funding, there are many people who lose out. To give a precise example, Canadians living with disabilities often will get benefits that are way larger than what you would see in any kind of basic income model. As a very precise example, if you are a kid on social assistance and you need a wheelchair, you get a wheelchair. Getting a check for whatever dollars a month is not going to buy that kid a wheelchair. And so if we replace needs-based funding with a flat check, a flat amount, that's going to leave a lot of people behind and people who actually really, really need benefits. So of course, then the response always comes, oh, we're not going to leave those people behind. We're going to leave all existing benefits in place and layer a basic income on top of that. Well, then we're back in the world where we are. So I just think that a lot of the discussion here needs to focus on two things. One is tackling seriously with how you would deliver and means test this if you were going to do it, and understanding that we already know a lot about that, and it's really the same conversation we're always having. And secondly, really thinking carefully about how desirable it is to move away from needs-based testing towards a universal model of benefits. And it's not clear to me at all that that's good policy.
Catherine, if I can, just one word, because I think for those who are interested, I would certainly encourage you to look at the Finnish example. Finland introduced only a few years ago a pretty large-scale program of guaranteed basic income. It was targeted only in the sample of the long-term unemployed. But the idea, the notion was that even if these long-term unemployed would have got back into employment, they would have kept the benefit. Unfortunately, for a number of reasons, not only in terms of the practicalities of the implementation of the schemes, they had to suspend the pilot in the middle of it. But there was a huge political pressure, precisely for the reason that Kevin and I have been raising, that there's a lot of confusion out there about what a basic income actually is, how it is delivered, and whether they substitute existing programs or not. But I think the Finnish example, among the recent one, is a very interesting one. It was very well designed as a pilot, but actually fell into a number of complications in terms of the full implementation.
Yeah, just to pick back up on that, one part of the question is to pick out one other part of the question was whether there are particular circumstances where this kind of thing might make sense. And I think there are, and I think we're going to see some of that when we see the BC report come out, that there are circumstances in life and in particular places where this kind of model can make more sense. When we think about improving our social assistance system at the provincial level, improving ease of access, giving more autonomy to people, thinking more carefully about how we allow people to leave benefits and go to work and maybe keep some more of those benefits as they go to work. These are all things that we can learn from the basic income folks about how to design our existing programs. So I think there's a lot of stuff that we can do, and those are exciting things that can improve the lives of people. I don't think that starts with cutting out flat checks to everyone.
Thank you both very much. There's another question from the floor. Dr. Scarpetta, it is directed at you, towards you. And the question is if you could share information on childcare measures or interventions by OECD countries as a means of support for parents to return to work, especially where traditional or the usual childcare arrangements have become unavailable. And Dr. Milligan, I know you've written on this, you've written on childcare from a tax perspective quite extensively, so I think you probably have some skin in this game too. So, but Dr. Scarpetta, to you first for a response.
No, indeed, I think there are a number of OECD countries. I can point you to the publication of the Employment Outlook, in which we list actually what individual countries have done, that have introduced specific income support for families, for families with children, precisely because of the very specific nature of the shock in which schools were closed. And many parents had to combine to some extent their own work from home to telework together with the responsibility for their children. Again, these were ad hoc measures that were introduced over and above, if you like, the childcare benefit that were in there, they were there before. And actually they were given to everybody, more or less, regardless of the type of employment and labor contract they had. I think, again, is another good point. This was a very specific shock. So again, government imposed to close down schools, and therefore many parents had to not rely on childcare facilities. They had to take care of their kids, and there was a need to provide them with income support to allow them to work and to take care of their children. But I think is one of the areas in which, again, lessons can be learned about how and whether to adapt the childcare system on a more regular basis. Again, the important point of some of the measures country introduced was that this was given to everyone. It was not just, associated with other type of labor contract and so on.
Yeah, a couple of points on childcare. First, within Canada, consistent with international evidence, the cost of childcare is a major determinant of the work behavior of specifically women with preschool age kids. And so that's clear that when subsidized care is available, more women are able to work. It's point one. Point two, this may be a bit less well known, but is also perhaps quite intuitive, that this has a very long run impact on those women. So taking the example of Quebec, which introduced subsidized care in the 1990s in a very broad model, when you look at the cohorts of women who benefited from that in the late 90s and early 2000s, and you walk forward 10 years to when their kids were like 13 and 14 years old, they're back in, the kids are 13 and 14 are in school at that point. What you see is that relative to other Canadians and relative to earlier cohorts of women in Quebec, those women who had access to this program maintained their higher labor force attachment, even after the kids were 10 years back in school. And so the point being, this has a permanent impact on the trajectory of women in the workplace, women in society, women in the family. This is a really, really important intervention in thinking about how it affects women in the workplace and women in society. So that all said, thinking about the impact of this shock, which has made childcare less available because of social distancing regulations or necessities, and other challenges within the childcare provision, this has the potential of having a long run impact on women in the workplace. And so I think we need to think about this. I am, compared to some others, I'm less convinced that this is actually a dollars issue as a actual logistics issue. We can shower a bunch of dollars at families or at provincial governments. That doesn't change the reality that having more than X number of kids in a daycare is just not safe from a COVID point of view. And we can't snap our fingers and create twice as many square footage of space. We perhaps could have done more in trying to do that over the last couple of months, but in the very short run of what's happening in fall 2020, I'm less convinced that dollars was the challenge there. Compared to logistics. But what I can say from the evidence is that that shock that is happening right now as we speak has the potential of having a long run impact on women in the workplace, women in the family, and we want to be attentive to that. And maybe as we get past this short run and we get into 2021, we want to think very carefully about ways we can start using dollars to ameliorate that and to improve on that, to make sure that any long run impact is limited.
If I can add just a point on that, because I think I fully agree with Kevin, and this is not a dollar issue, it's more an institutional logistic issue. And I think, again, it's important to distinguish what were the interventions that were put in place during the COVID crisis, given the exceptional nature of this crisis, compared to the long-standing childcare and family policies. I think one of my preferred charts, but it's very deeply worrying for my own country, Italy, if I look at the participation rate of men and women in my country, in Italy, you see a significant gap that opened up around the age of 30 or 35. The problem is that in my country, this gap never closed back. If I compare that with countries like France and Sweden, certainly countries that have a more well-established for a long period of time of childcare policy and family policy altogether, you see the same gap opening up, but this gap tends to close fairly quickly. So again, what we're talking about here is a well-established systemic family and childcare policy that can potentially really make a difference in terms of the behavior of mothers and fathers and households. I think what the specific measure that we have been discussing during the COVID crisis were backstop to actually provide immediate support to families with children, but I think, again, can be part of a broader reflection about how to strengthen comprehensive and effective family and childcare policies.
Well, thank you both very, very much for this. I'm pushing the limits of our time, given we also have some closing remarks from Margaret to do. A huge thank you to both of you. It's been a fascinating topic. It's been fascinating for me being kind of in the hub of some of this in terms of how we're figuring it out here at Employment and Social Development Canada, but also just writ large in terms of social policy in this country and looking at international examples, lessons learned, things that are going well, things that where we really need to take a good, close, hard look at what the data is suggesting to us coming in to make sure that we're ready for the best possible policy responses. So from my perspective, hugely valuable discussion from both of you. Thank you so much. So I would like to extend formally my thanks to Dr. Scarpetta and Dr. Milligan for participating and for really taking on board so many questions, varied questions from the floor. We didn't get to everything. So behind the scenes, there's a lot of people that would be sitting right now in the plenary room looking disappointed they wouldn't have gotten to a mic. They are in the chat room right now feeling that same disappointment. But we've tried to consolidate them to really get as many of them done here as possible. I'd like to thank, again, the time that you've given us to hear and think through these important issues, particularly to help broaden our thinking both nationally and on the global situation we're all facing at this time. Margaret, I'm going to be quiet now and hand this over to you. But again, Dr. Milligan, Dr. Scarpetta, thank you so much. Very, very important discussion here today.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you to our terrific speakers and commentators, Stefano Scarpetta and Kevin Milligan, for such a wide-ranging and probing overview of the impact of this crisis and the policy responses to date. Thank you also, Catherine, for your expert moderation, for steering us through this immense topic and very excellent questions that we received from the floor. So, and a huge thank you to all of you who are participating in this discussion. As Catherine said, I'm sure there were a lot of questions that weren't able to be brought forward, but thank you for participating. There's just so much to discuss. But let's just turn to tomorrow, which is Thursday, which will be the third in the series this week. We're going to take some of these issues that Stefano and Kevin have touched on, and we're going to drill deeper into many of them. We're going to put the spotlight on those at risk of being left behind. So we're going to hear from US, UK, and Canadian experts who will take these issues and go even further. The impacts of this crisis on different demographics, generations, sectors, occupations, and regions, because the impacts, as we've heard today, have not been the same everywhere. So our four speakers will be Heather Boushey, who's the president and CEO of the Center for Equitable Growth in Washington, D.C., from the US, of course, US perspective. Laura Gardner, who's the research director at the Resolution Foundation in the UK, will bring us more of a British UK perspective, and 2 Canadian experts, Carrie Barassa, who's the director of the Institute of Indigenous Peoples Health at the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and Rennie Morissette, who's a senior economist at Statistics Canada. So this session will be moderated by Denise Cole, who's the Deputy Minister of Seniors and Accessibility in the Government of Ontario. So a really important session. It'll be from 12 Eastern Daylight Time to 2 p.m. So please join us. Please join us by using the unique URL that you received in the confirmation email for registering. This is the same link you can use for each of the sessions and throughout the next 2 weeks. Now, before closing, again, I'd just like to acknowledge and thank our sponsors, Employment and Social Development Canada, the Ministry of Community and Social Services in Ontario, and the City of Toronto. Without their support, we wouldn't be able to mount this kind of an event, bring these leading experts to this virtual discussion. So a huge thank you to them. So hope to see you all tomorrow, again, for a really fascinating discussion, and thank you to the panel today.